Hi, this is Paul. When was it? 4 days ago, I guess. I posted a just chatting video, part of a just chatting video where we talked a little bit about the title of the video was Processing Kanye's Anti-Semitism in this little corner, working through religious pluralism within families. And it was in the morning, and I was just emptying the dishwasher and making breakfast and doing a few things, and caught the just chatting and thought it was a good conversation. It was so much fun to see Tayo in the mix, and Andre hadn't seen him for a while, and so yeah, it was an interesting time. The comments were interesting. So Peterson and Schultz talked a bit about Kanye, and then Peterson says this.
And
I'm planning to talk
really
to him
fascinating.
soon, I think.
Say again?
I'm planning to talk to Kanye soon, I think.
I think that's gonna break the internet. but Schultz made a comment in that video about how this very much gets into the distributed cognition and the sense making through principalities. If someone is a contrarian, people who have a degree of grievance sort of go around the contrarian. As I say often, that consciousness, awareness, I mean, Eamon sort of pushed back on that a little bit. It's monofocal in that there's one thing, and we have difficulty keeping one thing in our mind, and so then two things, it's sort of, well, this is against that thing, and so things sort of, our perception sort of leans us towards there's one thing, and then there's the thing against it, and then sometimes we can handle three things in our mind, but after that, most people just sort of drop off. And so if Kanye is attacking the people we don't like, we're on Team Kanye. And so it's the whole Kanye thing has sort of been fascinating, to watch. I'm still trying to figure out how to use these cameras and these scenes. And so then I almost never listen to Jordan Peterson videos when he's talking to a politician, just because most conversations with politicians just aren't that interesting, because in many ways the politician is such a pure principality, they have to sort of stick to a party line. But then all of the interesting comments about the comments on this video. Now, Jordan will often say, I don't know where to see the percentage of likes and dislikes on something. Rick sent me a note and said, look at the percentages of likes and dislikes. And Jordan will often make comments on how videos are, so his videos they're like 95, 96, 98% favorable, thumbs up. And I never think much of that, because for the most part, if you're doing long form videos, number one, a lot of people are just using the thumbs up so that they can mark the video so they can find it a little bit later easily on your liked video thing within YouTube. Another reason is that if you're regularly coming to a channel, you already like what's going on in that channel. And so much of YouTube is sort of this psychological practice of I go to YouTube, I listen to things I agree with. They're a little bit better said than I can say. They're a little bit better produced. They're on a screen of light. In many ways, going to YouTube is all about being validated by these beings of light, these screens of light. And if Jordan Peterson or whoever your YouTube people are, if they are basically telling you you're right, that's deeply psychologically satisfying to us. And in many ways, churches work the same way. I long learned that in church, what many people want from church is for the minister to stand up and reaffirm what they already believe and convince them of what they already believe and strengthen what they all already believe. And again, I'm not saying this as some kind of expose or criticism. When Jordan Peterson says people don't like it when you kick them in their axioms, people do like it when you reinforce their axioms, because those axioms put together the the mythical home that they live in. And so churches, for that reason, are to many outsiders incredibly boring and incredibly repetitive, because what churches are doing for the adherents, I mean, it's called preaching to the choir. What churches are doing for the adherents is reinforcing basically their upper register worldview and their mythology and their story verse and all of that. Churches continue to reinforce that. And that's why churches are such powerful belief communities, because the songs reinforce it, the liturgy reinforces it, the ritual reinforces it, the architecture reinforces it. You just keep reinforcing that narrative structure within which we live, so the faithful can be comforted, can live on track. I mean, that's a deep function of what happens in religious settings. And again, this is part of the reason why if you don't believe in that, and if it's not the setting that you're looking to be reinforced, when you go to a church service that's sort of already mapped territory, you sit there and you listen, and they're just saying what they always say. And that's what goes on in church a lot. And again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. It's just helpful to notice, for many people, that's the function of church. And people who are high in openness or have the territory very marked, often people will then, so one of the big reasons people go to church is to just have everything reinforced. The second reason people go into church is to have a little bit of novelty or a little bit of smartness or something that will just not only reinforce but strengthen. And so that's what a lot of goes on in church. So then when you get to something like a YouTube video like this, and you look at the comments, well, then most of the time you're preaching to the choir, and people have come to the channel to be reinforced. But then when you get someone like Bibi Netanyahu with all of the controversy around Israel and Israeli politics and everything like that going for it, it's like whoosh. And that's some of what I got, interestingly enough, on the Kanye video is some people making comments basically like, well, Jordan Peterson is in the pocket. And I had never even thought of Jordan Peterson working for Ben Shapiro the Jew, until I started reading these kind of things in comment section. It's like, oh. And then of course, if you're a Jew and you're sensitive to anti-Semitism and you start reading comments like that, it's going to be like, oh. So it's a very interesting dynamic going on. Now, of course, a lot of what has touched this off has been all of the stuff going on surrounding Kanye West and what's going on around him. Now, one of the more interesting things to emerge from this is Scott Adams' take on all of this stuff. And Bethel noted that I have my Twitter street irregulars, because I often, and many of you do this in the comment section and on Twitter and in direct messages on Twitter or emails or something. You'll send me messages basically saying, so-and-so said this, you should go check it out. And I always say, well, give me a link and a timestamp, because the amount of things that many of you are sending to me is more than I can digest. And so if you send me a link and a timestamp, I can go there quickly and see it. And so what I often do then is I'll often make a clip of it and I'll post it on my Vanderclips channel so that I can find it. So yesterday, in 147, not yesterday, but earlier this week in 147, Scott Adams started talking about Kanye, and he was beginning to make some really interesting observations.
To look a lot like financial professionals. Industry was bullshit. Prove me wrong. Find somebody who did that, even shade it a little bit. What do you need to say about Ye? Can you handle it? A little bit? All right. Let me give you a little...
It was interesting in 150 this week is that he noted that, this is the story of Scott Adams, that he was like many in California, like myself, a reliable Democratic voter. And then, of course, in 2016, he's like, well, I think Trump's going to win. And he called it. And he's basically had a YouTube career ever since, and on Twitter. And, this has been a supplemental income for him, besides his books and besides Dilbert, et cetera, et cetera. But, I like Scott. And he often has some interesting ideas. And then he went on about this.
Walk in the park of the history of Ye. I want to see if you can put all of these little pieces together into anything that feels like a pattern. See if you can find the pattern. Okay. So you remember when Ye interrupted Taylor Swift's award-winning thing, and he got up there, and instead of letting the award ceremony progress in its normal way, he got up there and said, probably the main thing you should not say in that situation, which is somebody else should have won this award. Right? Would you agree that whatever else it was, and you'll have lots of descriptions of how bad it was, would you agree that he shouldn't have said it? Can you all give me that? It was something that very specifically you should not have said, even if you believed it. You shouldn't say it out loud in public. Yeah. So that happened. Do you know what Ye was criticized for when he was just doing music? Do you remember what the biggest criticism of Ye was when he was just the artist doing music? Anybody remember? Because it's weird that you forgot. His songs were insanely misogynistic, said his critics. Insanely misogynistic. Now,
I'm going to speed this up a little bit because it's kind of a long, it's basically, this whole section is 37 minutes. I'm not going to play the whole section, so I'm going to speed it up a little bit.
Who thinks that in the last 20 years you could be a public personality and talk shit about women and you could get away with it? So he said a lot of the stuff you're not supposed to say about women, right? So he did that, and really, like, who goes after women, like, and just insults them and makes money on it? Well, rappers. So he comes from a world in which saying the thing you're not supposed to say is exactly your job. Right? Do you think rappers say what is socially acceptable?
And of course, when on the Just Chatting stream we were talking about Kanye, we were talking about the fact that he's a fool. Now, some people took offense to me calling him a fool, thought that I was insulting him, but no, it was a Pageauian observation of the fool, because the fool sort of works in this liminal in-between border space and says what you're not supposed to say. That's in some ways what the court jester does. And actually, I finished watching the House of Dragons show, which I really enjoyed. And of course, there's this situation there where the queen-to-be, the princess, marries a gay man, and they're unable to conceive a child between them, and so she's having children with the captain. Oh, spoiler alert! Sorry, she's having children with the captain of the city guard. And of course, in House of Dragons, they have this whole thing where all of the upper nobility of these certain houses have blonde hair. Even the black folks have all this blonde hair, and the kids are coming out with all of this brown hair. And so everybody knows that these kids are bastards, but nobody can say it until, of course, then when people say it, off go their heads. But that's a big part of the tension, and that's where you get into the court jester and the fool and all those things. And so that's sort of what we're talking about with all of this.
I feel like the essence of rap is saying things that would be uncomfortable for the people in charge. Things about women, things about their feelings about police, maybe praising bad behavior, illegal behavior, that sort of thing. So rap, by its nature, is artists who are saying the most dangerous things that you're specifically not supposed to say. Right? So that's part of the context. Now let's move on. Do you remember? Of course you do. When Ye said he likes Trump, wasn't that the one thing that a black man couldn't say in public at the time without huge consequences? It was. It was like the most dangerous thing a black man could say. And he said it over and over again. Do you remember when Ye went on, I forget which show, you'll tell me which show because I'm blanking, and he said that slavery, the history of slavery, He said there were so many more slaves than there were masters at the time. He said that slavery looks like a choice. Remember what happened when he said slavery looks like a choice? He basically insulted all of black America and much of white America and everybody else who might be supportive. And he said the worst thing you could say about black America. Like, I don't think you could have said a worse thing about black Americans. And did he say, I'm only talking about some black people when he said that? When he was being misogynistic, did he say, whoa, 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 hold on, no. I'm not talking about women. I'm not talking about bitches, to use his word. I'm talking about some individual women who have behaviors I don't like. Did he ever clarify that? I don't think so. When he talked about black people must have been a choice to slavery, did he say some of those black people must have treated it like a choice? He didn't. He treated it like black people or like a group that act together. Very offensive, when you say. Very offensive. Yeah. It was the worst thing you could say in that situation. When Ye made a turn toward being super religious, and suddenly he wasn't that edgy rapper, he was the super religious guy, did it ever occur to you that that was like the most dangerous thing that Ye could do? One of the most dangerous things you could have done, say 2 years ago, was to come out as super Christian and conservative, family conservative religious. It was just about the most dangerous thing you could say in public, if you think about it, right? Especially from where he was coming from. Most dangerous thing you could say. When he wore the White Lives Matter shirt with Candace Owens.
Now, I'm always really careful with Scott Adams because there's games within games with this guy. So always remember that when you listen to Scott Adams.
Wasn't that the worst thing you could say in public about that time? It was the most controversial, worst thing you could say. Yeah. Now, did he say that some white lives matter and some do not? I don't remember. I think he treated white people like they were like one unit. But we're not, right? We're not one unit. There must be some white people that don't matter, like serial killers and stuff. But yet he treated us all like we're just one unit. Very unfair. So he's treated women as if they're like one thing. Very offensive. He treated white people like one unit. He treated black people like they're one group. And then he got to the Jews are trying to stop him from being successful. Wow. Third rail. It's the worst thing you could say in public and expect to get away with it. Right? Worst thing you could say. And he treated all Jews like it's like one group of people, when in fact we knew that just some specific individuals he had a problem with. Very unacceptable, treating an entire group as if they're one thing. And then he took it up a level. He said, I see good things about Hitler. Well, that's something you can't say. What is
now, of course, part of what's going on with this Kanye stuff, which Adams keeps pointing out, is part of the whole woke dialogue has been this groupism. And there's been all of this groupism, and that was something that Peterson initially very much disagreed with, his focus on the individual versus the groupism. And so then some of these transgressive individuals on the internet then come out with saying, oh, you want to play groupism? Here's groupism for you. And it's like, and so that's part of the transgressive shtick.
It's the worst thing you could say, the one thing nobody can say in public. Hitler has some good sides. You can't say that. It's the thing you can't say. Even with free speech, you can't say that. And then he teamed up with Nick Fuentes and said, Nick's great. Oh, you can't do that. You cannot do that. And then he started working with Milo Yiannopoulos. You can't do that. No. You cannot say there's anything good with Milo, because if you do, it would feel like you're supporting pedophiles, wouldn't it? Even though Milo is not accused of pedophilia, he is accused of something that has a different word, but people confuse with pedophilia. So I think he was talking about older teens, which technically is not pedo, but everybody sees it that way. Right? So I'm not making that distinction. I'm saying that Ye would know that people won't make that distinction. So associating with Milo put him in that sort of little supportive of a pedophile. Do you know what you can't say? You can never say anything that's even slightly supportive of a pedophile. So what do you say about Balenciaga when they were accused of being a pedophile organization? He defended them. Not the specific photo shoot, but he defended the company that is not defending itself from pedophilia. They're not defending themselves. Let me say it again. Balenciaga never said how the photo shoot happened and therefore explained why they're not really guilty. They never did. But Ye defended the group that is accused of being pedophile friendly. Do you know what you can't do? You can't do that. But he did it. Here's the pattern. Have you picked it up yet? You see the pattern? And then another hint came when I watched some more of the behind the scenes of Ye's visit to Alex Jones. And you see Nick Fuentes defending Ye's treatment of, quote, the Jews as like one group of people he has trouble with. And here's what Fuentes said. We're okay treating every other group as one group. To which I said, hey, that's so wrong in ways I can't quite articulate. No, Nick Fuentes, you fucking racist. Well, your examples are pretty good, but that's wrong. That's so wrong. Except, makes you think, doesn't it? Makes you think. Now, if anybody's new to my live stream, I don't like Hitler completely. Like, I hate his fucking little mustache. I hate the lint in his fucking pocket. He's all bad. Because I know what to say in public, right? It's not hard. Now, here's the question that's going to blow your fucking head off. You ready? You ready for this? Let's accept that Ye has some mental conditions. Maybe he's bipolar, maybe something else. Do you think that any of the mental conditions that Ye is accused of would make him incapable of knowing what things to say to make him popular with the public and what things to say that would make him very unpopular with the public? Do you think he can't tell the difference between saying the right thing and saying the thing that will absolutely get you in trouble? Do you think he can't tell the difference? Somebody says yes, that if it's mania, if he's in the mania phase, he can't tell the difference. I would think the mania phase means he's not afraid of consequences. I don't think it makes you unable to see what's right in front of you. So here's my take. It seems deeply unlikely that he was surprised by any of the reactions to any of the things I mentioned. Do you think he was surprised by any of it? No. Do you think he would know exactly what to say and do if he wanted to get back into the good graces of the public? Of course. Of course, we all do. It's not like it's a hard question. It would be the easiest question in the world. Just say you didn't mean any of those things, apologize for it, do some good works for people you might have hurt, that sort of thing. Now, what about the perfectly valid complaint from the Jewish community that Ye's rhetoric puts an extra risk on Jews? True or false? The way Ye talks makes them feel uncomfortable and adds some extra risk to their life. True, absolutely true. Now let's go full Nick Fuentes and compare that to everybody else talking about anything. Do you think that the way the Democrats talk about me puts me at greater risk of literally being killed? Yes or no? Is the way they talk about me on social media every day will be a risk of physical danger? Yes, absolutely. Have you ever seen me say that they need to...
Now, don't have to go through all of this with him, but the point is clear. This is what Kanye is doing, and he's doing it intentionally. Now, why is he doing it intentionally? How does this stack up with mental illness? And I think Adams is right. Well, he's not thinking about consequence, but does Kanye not know what to say to try to get him out of it? So that was podcast 1947, and where he went with it today was also very interesting.
Here's something that occurred to me yesterday, and I've been laughing about it ever since. I think Ye is the new Don Rickles. Do you feel it? Ye, who used to be Kanye, he's the new Don Rickles. Now, if that doesn't mean anything to you, go to YouTube and find a clip of Don Rickles working the audience. You will know that everything he says is insanely racist and bigoted. But because he treats everybody the same way, including his own people, I guess, whatever that is, then people say, oh, that's just the act. And then they laugh at it because it's more like he's mocking racists than being one. Everything he says, if you heard it out of context, everything individual is like totally racist. But if you hear it all, you go, okay, he's mocking racists. He's being so racist, it's sort of like a joke on racists. And I think Ye, look at all the things that he's criticized. Taylor Swift didn't deserve to win. Can you give me a fact check on this? Did Ye say that Taylor Swift didn't deserve to win? Those are my words, not his. But did he say it was because of color? Am I correct? Yeah, race was part of that, right? So he treated white people and black people like they were a monolith. And so he basically said something racist about white people. Might have been accurate, but it was racist nonetheless, because it treats white people as sort of a group that's acting in one way. He said that slavery looks like a choice, which is a deep insult to black Americans. So he's insulted white Americans and black Americans. He said white lives matter, which is an insult to black Americans, according to some black Americans. He said, I like some parts of Hitler, which is an insult to everybody, but especially the Jewish community. He said that Elon Musk looks Chinese. Which sounded, I don't know what that was, but it sounded a little bit racist or something. I don't know. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Has Ye ever said something in his lyrics that would be considered misogynist? Has Ye ever been accused of saying anything about women that would be misogynist? He had a song called Gold Digger. No. All right. But anyway, so the point is this. Has Ye insulted everybody yet? has Ye insulted everybody? Because when he supported Trump, I mean, Ye has insulted black people more than he has insulted anybody else. Would you agree? That the group he has insulted the most as a monolith are black Americans. Now, he didn't do it like directly, but he said he liked Trump. That was an insult to black Americans, according to many black Americans. He said slavery looks like a choice because there were so many black slaves compared to their owners. Right? I feel like he's insulted his own category more than he's insulted anything else. But he's kind of hit everybody, didn't he? Didn't he hit everybody? Yeah. So I wonder if he can pull off the full Rickles. It looks like he's going full Rickles. If you go full Rickles, there's actually a way out. And it looks like he's in his third act and there's no escape, right?
See now, I want to make a distinction here because I think it's pretty clear that Kanye is not doing Don Rickles. Don Rickles, this gets deeply psychological because on one hand, Don Rickles, at a certain level of his own self-consciousness, knew exactly what he was doing, was rewarded for it, kept doing it. There's a really fun documentary about Don Rickles. I think it was on Amazon Prime. And it was just fascinating. I didn't know that much about Don Rickles. Of course, I grew up when Don Rickles was very famous, and so he was on TV. He was always on these variety shows. Just Freddie would not like it if I failed to mention the smash hit variety show, the Freddie and Paul show. I suggested to Rick this week that that maybe there should be the Freddie and Rick show, and Rick said that wasn't going to happen. So I was a little disappointed by that. But so Don Rickles is out there, and I think Scott Adams has it correct that the way Don Rickles goes about this, he's sort of mocking racism by being a racist. So in that sense, Rickles himself is the fool, and so he's sort of playing the fool. He's playing the court jester, and that's what Rickles has done. Kanye is not doing that. My take on Kanye all along has been he is of a class of people that has no filter. And whether he has no filter because he doesn't want to have a filter, he understands what a filter is. He is, I think, conscious of himself, at least to a degree, and in many ways, how this works. Again, collective cognition. We all think through each other. Principalities. We find individuals that we focus on in order to think through them. YouTube. We go to YouTube and we go to the dark mirrors and we go to our screens and we go to set in order to find the principalities that we are going to give our attention to, which a la Jordan Peterson is something akin to worship, to give our attention to in order to have it reinforced. You go to church to hear someone who knows a little bit more theology than you, who's pretty clever with sermon illustrations, who understands very much the tradition of your particular religious tradition, and can reaffirm for you as a community through songs, ritual, scripture, all of that, who can strengthen your narrative, your story verse foundations, so you can face the torments of the world. That's what religious services do, and Protestants do a lot through words, through speaking, through preaching, and through songs. That's Protestants. Catholics and Orthodox use sacraments and rituals and smells and bells and architecture. It's all about reinforcing those foundations, those axioms, because when we get kicked in them, they hurt. So religion is for that. And now what Kanye is sort of he's sort of an unfiltered. So for a while, when Twitter first started, there was a big debate over Twitter apps, because when Twitter first started, it was sort of hard to get off the ground, like many new things, and they had their website, and Twitter was always going down, if you remember the early days, and there were all these Twitter apps that you could get, and these Twitter apps had basically connection, and correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section, connection to the fire hose. They could basically get the raw Twitter feed, and so then the Twitter apps could sort of, pull out the particular feeds of the people you wanted to follow in separate columns. There are all these Twitter apps and websites that were doing that kind of thing. And then Twitter was trying to figure out how to monetize this thing, and of course, maybe have ads like Facebook has over on a column, or like Google, maybe do the ad thing. And Twitter has kind of done that, because the big question with Twitter was, how are you going to monetize this thing? How are you going to actually make money on Twitter? You've got people's attention, but how are you going to do that? And so one of the things that they did was, okay, we're going to have ads on the website, but then those apps, those Android apps, those other apps, they're all a threat to your monetization scheme. So what Twitter did was cut off people from the fire hose. You no longer have access to the whole stream. Now, in some ways, what Kanye is someone who has access, really amazing access, because remember, he used to be married to the goddess of the Temple of Attention, the queen of the Temple of Attention, the priestess of the Temple of Attention, Kim Kardashian, who, more than most has made a career and a fortune and a billion, not taking anything away from her smarts or business acumen or any of that, but she was able to get famous for just being famous and monopolize that and run it to the top. And of course, she marries Kanye West, and you just can't make this stuff up. So Kanye, in many ways, is sort of the channeler of the zeitgeist, either transgressive, and there's always, there was a show done by, I think it was Frontline, the PBS series Frontline, a number of years ago, called The Merchants of Cool. And it was a really good program, and there's lots of other programs that have welled up. Well, what is it about cool? Well, it's about, it's order and chaos, and you're always there on the edge. And so that's where Kanye sort of, you almost get images of, and Friday Morning Nameless can, I'm sure, whip up a movie and pull up movie clips, and I can't pull them up from my mind, but that's why I do my distributive cognition with Friday Morning Nameless and Grimm and Sam and everyone in this little corner, because we're actually sort of just creating a little hive mind through which we think through each other. And how many movies of you're touching something and you're going to be kind of a medium. And so, but now, of course, the fire hose of reality is way, 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 way too large to be channeled through one. And so Kanye is sort of on a certain level. And I think Scott Adams has it correct that Kanye is really onto the transgressive theme of this. This is the forbidden thing. And now it's important to remember that's how culture works, that's how religion works. If you look at, the part of the Torah I'm really excited to have Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot and others get to is really the Mosaic Code and the Mosaic Law about clean and unclean and what that means, because the forbidden is the sacred in many ways. And whether it's the forbidden or the height of attention, it's sort of circular in that they're deeply connected. The more forbidden, the more holy. And so part of what Kanye has been doing, and this includes his religious dimension, is he has been seeking out the holy, and he's been doing this through the transgressive. Now, there are people who are, just by virtue of nature and nurture and spirit and all kinds of things, way more inclined to that than other people. And Kanye is clearly way up that list, because if you manage to repeatedly strike the right chord in music and in fashion and in all of these, it means in some ways he's got his hand on the zeitgeist and he's channeling it. Chad, I'm going to wait for your video about this, because you're going to think of the right movie to have this. And I can think of, just foggily in the back of my mind, probably an hour from now, movie references will come up that I don't usually put movies in these things, because I don't know, Chad seems to be able to do it well. But someone is like, Kanye is in that way a medium or an oracle in our culture, and he is channeling the duality of the forbidden and the holy. Okay? That's what Kanye is doing. And I think Scott Adams really nailed it there. And again, Adams too is in a different way like this. I've been appreciating basically what he's been doing with his podcast, because I run up against a half dozen things a day that I think, oh, I'd really like to make a video about that. I'd really like to think that through. I'd really like to talk about that, but I don't have the time in the day to do it. And so what Scott sort of does with his live stream is he lines up his little news stories and he sort of walks through them. And part of me was thinking, boy, that would probably be a pretty good thing for me to do, sort of every day, a little live stream. And so some of you might have noticed I've been dropping little videos in. Part of the reason I reset up my office is so that while I'm working here, if I have an insight for just a little short video, I can very quickly rearrange the office, do a video, and then go back to work. And so this is what's going on with Kanye and Scott, and I think Scott Adams really nails it, that Kanye is sort of doing this oracular work in the culture. Now, if I title this video the way I'm going to title it, I know a lot of you are thinking I've only touched half the subject because, well, so the rest of history has done they did an episode. They're going through the World Cup and countries that made the World Cup, and they're sort of doing these little country summaries and these little shows. But of course, how are you going to summarize the history of a country? Well, you usually just picked a little anecdote. And Tom Holland chose to take the anecdote of the burning Servetus at the stake in Geneva. And of course, because of all the attention I've given to Tom Holland, all kinds of people wrote me, my Twitter street irregulars, and they said, "Oh, you've got to talk about this episode." And I actually thought the episode was really good because what Tom Holland. So there are two sources that I'm going to show on this issue. I thought Ryan Reeves' treatment of this, of Calvin and Servetus, was excellent. And as Ryan Reeves notes, most of the time when you hear about this, it's sort of Calvinists being a little defensive, usually saying, this is just what happened in the 1550s, and you have haters of John Calvin saying, "Aha, look what an evil man he was at what he did to poor Servetus." And Reeves says, actually, the situation is a lot more complex. And in fact, the rest is history. I thought Tom Holland's treatment was excellent in showing. I really hadn't heard a treatment of this as sort of nuanced and I thought as good as Tom Holland's.
He turns up in Geneva and he describes it as famously as the most perfect school of Christ that ever was in earth since the days of the apostles.
So Geneva, at this point, is it a republic? Is it part of the Swiss Confederacy?
Yeah, it's a city-state. It's a city-state. Right. So Switzerland consists of a number of city-states, a bit like kind of ancient Greece or Renaissance Italy. And lots of them are great enthusiasts for the Reformation. But each city has a slightly different understanding of what the Reformation should be. And Geneva had not been kind of preeminent in this to begin with. It was Zurich, it was Basel. But Geneva comes up on the outside track and becomes this kind of shining example for Protestants of what a Christian community should be. But this is due to the leadership not of someone from Geneva, not even someone who's Swiss, but a Frenchman. And that Frenchman, he's born in 1509 in Paris, takes the name Jean Calvin. But of course, he's best known in the English-speaking world as John Calvin. Yeah, and that reflects the fact that his influence on Britain, on England and Scotland, and then by extension on the United States, is absolutely huge. It's I would say it's impossible to contemplate Anglo-American culture without reference to John Calvin. His influence is that enormous, and I think we should
and Holland is dead on right there.
Do a kind of an episode on him and his influence because it's a huge topic.
Of course, but just to sort of put it into really, really simplistic terms for people like me who are not devotees of theological history. Yeah. Calvin believes that there are two kinds of people, doesn't he? The saved and the damned.
He does. Well, yes, and most Protestants think that. But Calvin he's peculiarly rigorous in his kind of understanding of the theological implication.
Now again, when I play something like this, and I don't pause or correct things, it doesn't mean that I agree with everything that's going on. I had a little conversation with Mark about tolerance, and one of the things that you have to do if you're practicing relevance realization in a conversation, or even just doing a commentary or critique on something, is you have to decide what you're going to engage and what you're not going to engage.
Implications of this. So he's a very, very smart guy, very, very clever, schooled in law in Paris, would undoubtedly have gone on to become a kind of leading figure in the French court, had he not become a Protestant at a time where this renders him liable to violent persecution. And so he flees Paris, he flees France altogether, and he goes over the border into Switzerland, and he tries out kind of various cities to see which seems to him the most promising in terms of setting up a godly republic, but also which will offer him a sanctuary. And so he tries various places out. He goes to Zurich, he goes to Bern, he goes outside Switzerland, goes to Strasbourg. All of these are kind of leading Protestant cities. But he ends up in Geneva, and he has two cracks at staying in Geneva. So he goes there in 1538, and he piles in, and he tries to mold it into a godly community. And this does not go down well. The Genevans don't want a Frenchman turning up and telling them they can't do things.
Right.
And so he gets run out of town. But 3 years later, Geneva is in such a rundown state. Its government is inefficient. It seems to be in a state of absolute moral decline, that the city elders decide that they will invite Calvin back. And Calvin is very clear that he will only come back basically if he has the kind of the run of the city. So he says, if you desire to have me as your pastor, then you will have to correct the disorder of your lives. And the city elders give him carte blanche to do this. And Calvin absolutely seizes his opportunity. And what's striking about him is that he does not impose a dictatorship. So this is not even equivalent to, say, Cromwell's protectorate. Mm-hmm. Calvin does not have any civic office. And in fact, until 1559, he doesn't even have Genevan citizenship. He lives unarmed. He doesn't have bodyguards. The people of Geneva are free to insult him. If they spit at him in the street, he just turns the other cheek. His only weapon, Dominic, is his pulpit.
Oh.
The reason that the pulpit...
And again, I think the way Holland sets this up, Tom's really, really good. The way Holland sets this up is the gift that Tom Holland has. I mean, anybody who's making a cultural contribution has, in one way or another, a sense of the zeitgeist in them. And I think the way Holland tells this story, and the way Holland tells many stories, he, all that connection in terms of collective relevance realization, Holland does that really well.
Pit is such a kind of key stage for him, is both to insult him. If they spit at him in the street, he just turns the other cheek. His only weapon, Dominic, is his pulpit.
Oh.
The reason that the pulpit is such a kind of key stage for him is both because he's a brilliant speaker, but also because he has thought through this great question of how Christian liberty, which he very highly prizes, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, all that kind of thing, how it can be squared with the necessary order that affirms the fact that this is indeed a Christian commonwealth. So in his understanding of how Christians should lead their lives and what a church should be, he sets an absolute premium on the freedom of every individual Christian to join and to leave a godly community.
That's nice.
The dictates of conscience are very, very important to him. But what he also appreciates, drawing on the lessons of Scripture and the theological inheritance of the Christian church, is that not everyone can be saved. And this is what you were alluding to, this idea that there are two kinds of people. There are those who are doomed to be damned and those who are saved. And Calvin's assumption is that the number of elect is very few, very small, that most people are predestined to be damned. And he says this is a dreadful decree. It seems a dreadful decree, but he doesn't shrink from it. And it's precisely because he knows that humanity has fallen, that most people will spurn the gifts of the Spirit, that he's so keen to kind of shape Geneva into a community that can exist in harmony with God's plans and thereby kind of attract the elect to Geneva, so that the whole city will become a kind of a community of the elect, and thereby serve as a beacon to the rest of Christendom and to the rest of the world. And so the way that he kind of achieves this balance between liberty and order is that he institutes 4 offices that enable Geneva to be.
Now you could liberty, chaos, and order
Be run in according to his understanding of what a godly community should be. So there are ministers who preach the word of God. He's a minister. That's his role. He has teachers to instruct the young. So that's very important, get them young. He has deacons whose role is to meet the needs of the poor, the sick, the orphans, the widows, basically to provide charity. So this is essentially a welfare state within the fabric of Geneva. And obviously this is very, very appealing. So this is one of the reasons why, by and large, people in Geneva are happy to go along with Calvin's regime. And then he has elders, church elders, presbyters. So this is the origin of Presbyterianism. And these are basically kind of moral watchdogs.
Now, when he said Calvin's regime, you have to be careful because, again, key to what Holland is laying out here is that there's a differentiation already implicit to one degree between church and state. Now, there's a tight relationship between them, but these kinds of issues are going to be and going to have to be worked out. And at this point in the 1550s, these are many of the issues that are on the agenda, what they're trying to work through. So this isn't just about John Calvin. This is about Michael Servetus. And Servetus is a very interesting figure. So let's take a look at Servetus.
His circle, those who were attracted to some of his teachings, were there in the city of Paris. And Calvin tells us and reminds Servetus in a letter that the two of them had actually nearly met to discuss and debate some of these issues all the way back in 1534. Now, 1534, you'll remember in Calvin's biography, is just about the time when he is potentially going to be sought out for heresy himself, and he's going to be pushed away. It's in this context that we have the Nicholas Kopp affair and the affair of the placards, both of which ultimately send Calvin down into the Swiss Alps. Well, for whatever reason, we're not quite sure, Servetus had actually called for a meeting. Now again, Servetus at this point is already known as a radical, and we'll talk about his theology in just a second, but he's already at this point known as a real rabble-rouser when it comes to his theological position. Servetus is not simply just any old humanist there in the city of Paris. What seems to be happening, rather, is that Servetus had an eye for those who were on the fringes, those who were making the leap, perhaps, from humanism into the Protestant Reformation. And in this context, in the 1530s, it seems as if what Servetus wants is to potentially recruit Calvin, or at the very least, he wants to debate Calvin on a number of points. And this really is symptomatic of who Servetus was. He was a man who liked to fight, hot-blooded, face-to-face, eyeball to eyeball. And he had called for this meeting in 1534, and Calvin had showed up, but Servetus didn't. So for a number of years after this, for all the way down until the execution of Servetus in 1553, Calvin and Servetus are actually aware of each other. They're not friends, they're not colleagues, they don't actually seek each other out per se in the early years. But Servetus, in particular, always has his eye on Calvin. In fact, the earliest theological treatise that Calvin ever wrote was called the Psychopannychia. And this was a text in which Calvin laid out that he was opposed to the teachings of soul sleep. And soul sleep teachings are a bit complex. There were some in the early years of the Reformation who believed that the soul upon death doesn't actually ascend to heaven, it does not go before the throne, it does not meet Christ, but rather it sleeps, you might say, until the resurrection. And this seems to have been some of the things that Servetus was pushing against, traditional doctrines and coming up with alternative views. Now, Servetus isn't the only one to teach this, so it's a bit challenging to say that Calvin is writing this specifically against Servetus. But Calvin does believe that there are some, not a small number in fact, who are going too far in their rejection of traditional doctrines. We'll fast forward through Calvin's first stint in Geneva to his
Okay, so Servetus is in some ways like Kanye. And as we go further and further into Reeves' treatment of Servetus, we're going to see this more and more. He's got his in the 1550s. He's sort of got his thumb on the Zeitgeist, and he is transgressive in that if it's a Roman Catholic teaching or a magisterial Protestant teaching, he's going to be against it, and so Calvin, Luther, the Roman Catholics, the Orthodox all believe in the Trinity. He's going to be against the Trinity. And you're going to find this pattern again and again and again. And so in a strange way, Servetus is sort of like the Kanye West in the Protestant Reformation of the 1550s.
Exiled to Strasbourg, to now him returning to Geneva. In 1546, suddenly Calvin and Servetus begin to exchange a number of letters. And what happens from 1546 on, in a very strange way, frankly, and this is the part of the historical record that we just can't quite get our arms around, Servetus, without any hyperbole, really becomes obsessed with Calvin. He's almost a stalker. He repeatedly pummels Calvin with letters. He expects Calvin to write him back on every point. He's also very, very hyperbolic, Servetus is. Most of his letters and his treatment.
Now, let me tell you, having a YouTube channel, when you see this pattern, this personality type, it's like, I can think of some people like this.
Servetus all claim to have discovered some eureka, earth-shattering, cataclysmic view on the scriptures or on theology. And frankly, some of Servetus's claims, the braggadocio that he has, is just a bit too much. I mean, Ancient Alien sometimes has less hyperbole than Servetus does in some of his letters and his books. But what's interesting is that in 1546, Calvin doesn't really seek Servetus out. He responds to one of his tracts, but by and large, Calvin is aware of Servetus. He doesn't like his teachings, but he leaves him relatively alone. And it was in the 1540s that Servetus began to float the idea that he would come to Geneva, where he and Calvin would engage and spar with one another. Calvin's response in this time was, don't come. He says, your views are well known. In fact, they're quite problematic. People are looking for you at this point in your life, Servetus. And he tells him that he cannot guarantee his safety should he come to Geneva. And he says, anyway, quote, my authority is of no avail. Now, sometimes people see this and they think Calvin is lying, that he's just kind of brushing off and blaming others for the ominous tone that he's giving Servetus here. That if he comes to Geneva, he's going to be executed. But Calvin says, it won't be me, it'll be somebody else. Well, as we've seen repeatedly, in the context of the 1540s and the 1550s, Calvin is actually increasingly under fire. The magistrates continually put Calvin in a box. They continually draw the line in the sand, and they always, always, always want Calvin to be one of their henchmen, one of the people that they've hired, and not the top dog, you might say, in the city in terms of its decision-making.
Now, what you hear there, and Reeves doesn't pull this relationship out, this dynamic out, the way that Tom Holland does. But you hear in Reeves the sense that there's politics going on in the city, and Calvin, of course, has a figure in the city because the assumption of the city council, including, is that this should be a godly city. And if you read anything from the Reformation, you'll notice that it's often the civic authorities who are making decisions, again, about the religion of the town, because the religion of the town has everything to do with, well, what the nature of the town is going to be like. Now, the idea of a secular state had not yet emerged. But part of what's going on in the Protestant Reformation and in this area of Switzerland is key, and later it'll be in the Netherlands, and a lot of this will get sent. There's a wonderful biography about Roger Williams and his and America, and how all of this is part of sort of the early things that are going to bubble up and come to America as ideas about religious liberty, and then, in a sense, religious pluralism, freedom of conscience, a lot of the things that today we simply take for granted. But this is sort of the place that all of this stuff is getting worked out. And actually, this Servetus episode becomes a really key episode in terms of the working through of this. Now, I'm going to argue as I, continue to get a little bit more into the Servetus episode here. We are probably doing similar things with Kanye right now. Only, of course, we're living in a different time. But we're working through these issues that Tom Holland is pointing out in the podcast, that we're still working on them. We're just at a very different stage in them, because now we have this idea of secularity, we have freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, church and state. We have all of these things, but all of these things are basically being worked through at this point in Geneva and other places in Switzerland and in Europe. All of these ideas are being worked through there. Now, those who sort of cast an eye onto the Islamic world, to say no, and people will often say, well, Islam hasn't had a reformation in the sense of what Christianity has had. Well, this is the time and place that all this stuff is getting worked through. And again, Calvin is going to be critical in terms of how this stuff gets worked out.
So when Calvin says that his authority is of no avail, he's not lying. We have numerous other letters on other matters from this same period to all of his friends in the Swiss regions, where he's describing how much opposition he has in general amongst the magistrates. Now, it's not so much opposition that they kick him out again, but at one point he says, if he were to say the sky is blue, then some who govern the city would come up with an alternative color just to spite him. So
now again, they're working within this disagreement, but they're still staying in it, okay? It's not to the point that they're going to kick Calvin out again, which they had done before. It's not to the point that they're killing each other. They're working through the disagreement.
Calvin's not lying here. Calvin doesn't want Servetus to come to Geneva, but he does say, if you were to come, and if I were to even attempt to give you free passage to come and debate for a while, I can't even guarantee that they would obey, that they would take my word for it and allow you to leave. Now, right then and there, it should be pointed out that Calvin from the 1540s is telling Servetus, don't come to Geneva. Stay away. Again, one of the big mysteries. Why in the world does Servetus come? We really don't know. And by and large, the situation goes a bit cold. Calvin essentially writes Servetus off as a man who won't budge an inch on any of his views. Well, what were his views? Well, unfortunately, too much is made of Servetus being something of a proto-Enlightenment rationalist. It's sometimes alleged, and this really does come about later when men like Voltaire and others in the Enlightenment actually cite Servetus as one of their predecessors. Servetus was a scientist. He was a doctor. It is to Servetus, for example, that the credit goes for discovering that the circulatory system was based on the pulmonary system itself. Now, it's sometimes said that Servetus discovered circulation itself. That's not the case. Or some have said that he discovered what the heart does. That's also overstated. Rather, what Servetus's claim was, historically, scientifically, was that the heart's primary function was to drive the circulation of the blood through the body.
Okay, now this section is important because Servetus is not crazy. Now, okay, back to Kanye. Does Kanye probably have some issues with mania? Doesn't seem unreasonable. Is he crazy? What do I mean by crazy? Is he not dealing in the same story verse as the rest of us? No. In fact, in some ways, he's dealing in a very high level of the story verse. Does that mean I agree with what he's saying or what he's doing? No. I mean, a little bit later in that Scott Adams video, Scott Adams is very clear. He says, I'm not supporting him. And Peugeot says exactly the thing about Kanye. He says, don't follow him, just watch him. He's not crazy. I mean, I will meet unmedicated schizophrenics and I will talk to them, and it will, well, they've got their finger on some things, and they're probably getting some associations correct, but the associations are just so flat out insane. That's crazy. Servetus was not crazy, but he's doing something else. Now, crazy is just sort of a dismissive way that we sort of decide, I'm not going to talk to these people. It's clear that Calvin decided he wasn't going to talk to Servetus because it was just going to be a waste of time, because, and that's probably the way it is talking to Kanye. It's probably going to be a waste of time because Kanye's just going to get on and be Kanye. Ask Alex Jones. I mean, I'll have Kanye on the show. Good luck, Alex. Ask Tim Pool. I mean, Jordan wants to talk to Kanye. Well, we'll have to see if that happens. But
so right then and there, you have a man who is a scientist in a manner of speaking. He's a bit of a rationalist. But unfortunately, this later Enlightenment view of Servetus is a bit off. Servetus's views are essentially that if anyone says it Catholic or Protestant, he really wants to take it down. There is some sort of radical commitment.
Did you hear that? If anybody says it, he wants to take it down. That's Kanye. I think Adams nailed him.
To the idea that all of these doctrines, just about any of them, frankly, that have arisen in church history are not based on Scripture. He challenges just about every doctrine, and he pokes everyone in the eye. He claims, for example, that the papacy is the invention of the devil. And again, his hermeneutic seems to be that anything that arose in church history as a result is de facto Catholic and therefore diabolical. So, for example, he denies the doctrine of original sin, doesn't believe that there is a need for a full atonement from Christ as God come down. He also denies fully the Trinity. He has a relatively concocted, strange set of views about the Trinity that are somewhat Arian, somewhat pantheistic. He doesn't believe that the Son of God is a creature per se. He believes that he is some sort of manifestation of who God is in this world. Well, the bedrock view that Servetus has, though, is something like pantheism. In fact, it is relatively purely pantheistic. He says that God and the world, the creation, are not separate. And in fact, God is somehow in all of the world itself. He is somehow manifested personally in every living thing, and therefore there is no separation between creator and creature. He also
and so again here you can see he's not crazy. These are ideas that are around. He's got associations, but he's also got a personality, and he's got a sense of what, well, if the Lutherans and the Reformed and the Catholic and the Zwinglians, if all these people agree on it in a certain way, he's going to be against it.
Also has weird, somewhat Manichaean views about demons and demonic activity and the role of the divinity within them. Now, a lot of this is well known in the evidence and in the secondary sources. The one that's always overlooked, though, is that Servetus was apocalyptic.
And of course, if you listen to Tom Holland's thing, Tom Holland does not overlook it. Tom Holland, goes right to it.
Servetus believed that the end of the world was going to happen by the end of the 16th century. He believed that the Archangel Gabriel was going to come, and that a number of features were going to happen, and that the world was going to come to an end. That factor, that last piece, is frankly the one that's always missing. Because Servetus is apocalyptic. He's millenarian. He believes that humanity and all the things that Europe is going through means that he and others are not long for this world. And he never quite says, but it is almost certainly the case that because that apocalypticism was driving him, that by 1553, Servetus essentially believes that martyrdom is his only option. Frankly, it's one of the only ways to describe what he does. Again, the obsession with Calvin, the constant desire to rile everyone up, frankly, the attacking of all kinds of doctrines, the allegations and the hyperbole that he uses, is meant to drive people crazy. He is trying to get a rise out of people. And again, he is obsessed with Calvin.
He is trying to drive people crazy. It's, in a sense, an apocalyptic vision. There is something deeply apocalyptic about Kanye West. There really is, in terms of how he behaves.
In 1553, Servetus again goes after Calvin in an attempt to start a correspondence with Calvin on the issues of Servetus's theology. In 1553,
if this would have been today, it would have been, I want a YouTube conversation with you.
Servetus had printed up one of his tracts, one of his more inflammatory ones, in which he attacked all kinds of things about the church. And it was published anonymously, but he sends this book and 30 unanswered letters to Calvin. And he complains that Calvin won't write him back. Now, I don't know about you, but after probably letter 20, I probably would have given up. Servetus doesn't want to give up, though. He wants Calvin's response. He's banging on the door saying, let me in, I want to talk.
Does this sound familiar? I mean, you could imagine Kanye doing something like this.
Well, it's at this point in 1553 that Calvin writes a letter to the city of Vienna and lets them know that Servetus is living there in the city. After Paris, Servetus had turned to taking a number of aliases, changed his name different times, and he would go around serving as a doctor, as a way to make money. Now, what's interesting about this is Servetus, again, is constantly seeking Calvin's response to this. And it does seem that Calvin knew he was in Vienna for quite some time. But it was only in 1553, when Servetus would not let up, that he wrote to the city of Vienna. They discovered that he was Servetus, and they arrested him. Now, in an alternative universe somewhere, the city of Vienna would have had a better prison system. Because here's the thing, Vienna is Catholic. They are not Protestant. They have arrested Servetus, and they are going to put him on trial. And again, in an alternative universe, they would have been the ones blamed for this execution. Calvin would have just been the one who tipped him off. But for whatever reason, Servetus very easily escapes, and he flees. Now, what happens next is almost incomprehensible, unless you take into account Servetus' apocalyptic vision of what's going to happen either to himself or by the end of the 16th century. Because Calvin again has said, do not come to Geneva. He's warned him. He has spoken actually quite harshly that he thinks his views are utterly heretical. And yet, in the summer of 1553, as Calvin was preaching, suddenly it was noticed that there on the front row was Servetus himself, and he was arrested. Well, once he was arrested...
Again, wouldn't you imagine Kanye West to do this? He will show up, and he will sit in the front row. He's going to be there.
Then Pandora's box was essentially opened. All kinds of problems began to arise. The contextual issues that we've already mentioned, that Calvin is not one to be sort of trusted to make all the decisions for Geneva on his own, reared their head here. Calvin was invited and instructed repeatedly to provide documentation theologically as to where Servetus was wrong. And Calvin does this. He speaks actually very negatively of Servetus and very hostilely in terms of his estimation of the moral virtue of Servetus, saying essentially that he's a fanatic and a man who's just sort of raving. However, Calvin had a number of reasons to believe that he was in the right to be this hostile. Because here's the thing, in 1531, before Calvin had fled to Paris, Servetus for a time had landed in the city of Bern and Strasbourg, and he had been nearly arrested at the time and nearly executed at the time for some of his views. There was the man Oecolampadius, one of the early reformed voices there in the Swiss regions, and he had actually nearly done the same thing that Calvin had done. Calvin cites this in the context of the trial of Servetus. The other factor that's in play here is that Geneva really can't do much on its own without making sure that the people that are their allies are on their side. So what happens is first they write to the city of Vienna, and they ask for a consult as to why Vienna had arrested this man. And that's actually telling. They don't actually take Calvin's word for it that Servetus is a heretic. They take it into account for sure. But it's not enough simply that Calvin and the College of Pastors there in the city of Geneva have declared him to be a heretic. They start asking around for all the political entities in their orbit to weigh in as well. Vienna actually writes back after the letter arrives and says, yes, thank you. Yeah, we're not sure what happened to him. He kind of got away from us there. Vienna actually requests that they send Servetus back to Vienna so that they could execute him. And Geneva, of course, says no to this. The next step is that not once, but twice, letters went out to the Swiss cities of Zurich and Bern and Basel and a couple of other smaller ones, requesting that they weigh in on the subject. And overall, the opinion that came back from these Swiss regions was unanimous. Bullinger, in fact, took Calvin's side entirely and was just as scathing and just as hostile to Servetus. And so Zurich sides entirely with Geneva. Bern and Basel and these other cities do nearly the same amount of siding with Geneva in terms of wanting to get rid of this man. However, they're relatively halting in terms of what their judgment is as to how this should be handled. What's interesting about Calvin during this, though, is he actually says that he hopes that the judgment is death, that there is a command given that Servetus would be put to death. But he writes to Farel, his hope was that the judgment would be mitigated, that perhaps he would just simply be left in jail. Now, that might be small beans for some people, but here we see Calvin doing something that is very 16th century. You see, because in this day and age, the majority of folks believed that heresy was not simply a difference of opinion, but rather that it was a moral blight that always had the potential to corrupt an entire city and an entire populace. Radical views, in other words, were always believed to be the first crack in the armor that leads people to riots, to protests, and to uprisings that are violent, bloody, and crazy. This was, in other words, a time when all kinds of people are being executed for their faith if they're deemed to be radical or heretical. This is a time when Anabaptists are being dunked and drowned in lakes and rivers because of their views on baptism. 1553, by the way, is also the time when Mary Tudor comes to the throne, and she will be relatively hostile, burning and executing nearly 300 Protestant leaders from the English world, forcing 1,000 or so others to flee to the continent. So this is a bloody time. Geneva actually is uncertain repeatedly as to what they're going to do. They know that he is a heretic, but they're not sure how to handle this. Frankly, they probably would have been better off just to send it back to Vienna and let them handle it.
Now you can begin to see where these two things are coming together. There's a sense that, well, principalities roaming around is dangerous for the public welfare. Someone might take control of the zeitgeist in a sense and lead everyone astray. And for that reason, well, how do we handle this? Do we let people go and say what they want, or should we, well, figure out what to do with them? Well, what to do with them? Well, maybe we kill them, then they stop talking. And that over history has been a lot of what people have done. Today, now, after the Enlightenment and all of this, we have the question of, well, what can we and can't we do in terms of speech? And, of course, this is right in the bullseye of Twitter.
Requires concrete definition, lest it be nothing more than an empty and meaningless signifier of virtue. Given that everyone wants and expects Twitter to prohibit at least some content, child pornography, doxing, commercial spam, what does it mean to declare oneself in this context to be a free speech absolutist? For me, free speech absolutism, a term I claim for myself as well, means allowing any and every political viewpoint to be heard. It is, of course, acceptable to ban certain kinds of verbal expression that does not qualify as political viewpoints, such as defamation or fraud or direct threats of violence made person to person to an individual. But free speech, to me, means that every political opinion, even the most repugnant and horrifying, in fact, I would say especially the most repugnant and horrifying, is free to be expressed, and that no centralized authority is empowered to ban or punish its expression. Unlike most people who apply this term to themselves, Musk, to his credit, has defined what he means by it. He wrote back in April, quote, "By free speech, I simply mean that which matches the law. That which matches the law. I am against censorship that goes far beyond the law. If people
now you'll hear Jordan Peterson. He's been making the same thing. Well, if he's running, this is what was Jordan Peterson's network? Oh, I forget. You'll put it down in the comment section. I guess it's still going, but this was the line that Jordan Peterson used.
Want less free speech, they will ask their government to pass laws to that effect. Therefore, going beyond the law while censoring is contrary to the will of the people. In other words, by free speech absolutism, Musk said he would only ban content which could be or has been made illegal by the government. So, for example, child pornography and fraud can be banned since that has been made criminal by the government, but expressing arguably racist and homophobic views, harshly criticizing Israel or even Jews, disagreeing with gender ideology, that cannot be banned on Twitter, according to Musk, because the law does not prohibit its expression. Agree with that or not, that's a coherent and easy to understand standard for how Musk said he intends to govern Twitter. Now, whether Musk realizes or not, this is not the standard that he is now using for determining what is and is not permitted on Twitter. Over the last week, there have been numerous instances in which several liberal left accounts, including a Meteor Matters goon and some people affiliated with Antifa, had their accounts suspended despite the fact that their offending tweets could not reasonably be interpreted as illegal. The account of the Meteor Matters operative was quickly restored without comment when liberals complained, but others remained banned. Elon Musk's prior refusal to reinstate the account of Alex Jones and Nick Fuentes, which were accounts that had been banned under the old Twitter regime, had already raised valid doubts about whether Musk really was prepared to live up to the free speech principles he espoused. Fuentes has never been found by a court to have violated the law for things he said, and while Alex Jones was successfully sued in a civil court by the parents of Sandy Hook students, that was not a criminal conviction, nor was it for things that he said or did on Twitter. Unless Musk is prepared to ban everyone with a criminal record or has ever been successfully sued for defamation, this refusal to reinstate those two accounts made little sense, except as a decision by Musk to prohibit any views to be heard on Twitter that are not just controversial, but deeply repugnant to a large number of people, or at least to Musk personally.
In other words, a lot of what Musk is doing is deciding what he does and doesn't want on Twitter. And as I mentioned in a previous video, we don't really have a principality deciding for us now. there's an individual, and some people might think that's an upgrade, and some people might think that's a bad thing, but here we are. So, but all of this is part of the process of figuring out, well, how do we live together? And to go back to the rest is history, the question is, well, how do you have we wouldn't say godly, because now we've developed secularism and all of these things. We would just drop one of the O's out and or add an O and say, well, we have a goodly society instead of a godly society. But we're still working through the same kinds of issues.
And so on.
Yeah.
And they all basically agree that Servetus should be executed. Calvin says, look, don't burn him, because that is too reminiscent of what the Inquisition do. But the city authorities decide that they will burn him. And they do this, I think, primarily to embarrass Calvin. Servetus becomes a pawn in the arguments and the power play between Calvin and his enemies in the city magistracy. And so...
And so you can see potentially some distance between Ryan Reeves here and Tom Holland, and that's pretty normal for two historians are going to look at this, and they're going to come to some different conclusions, partly to the degree that the narrative shaping of their whole story goes.
The news is brought to Servetus that he's going to be burned, and Calvin describes Servetus's reaction. At first he was stunned and then sighed so as to be heard throughout the whole room. Then he moaned like a madman and had no more composure than a demoniac. At length his cries so increased that he continually beat his breast and bellowed in Spanish, "Mercy, mercy."
Oh, so after all the martyrdom talk, Servetus, not unreasonably, when he's told the sentence, thinks, oh God, this isn't for me after all.
No.
And again, this is sort of what you expect from a human being. And, let's say if someone sort of, put the clamp down on Kanye, what would people think? Now, in the first, maybe I should pull it up and play it. Now, interestingly enough, if you want to look at, let's say, the relationship between Calvin and Kanye, think about this little tidbit.
Do you think he could ever make his money back? Well, one of his projects, which is still live, unless something's changed recently, is, he had intended to build communities that were designed communities so they'd be better places to live. And would solve, a number of problems that our current social situation doesn't solve.
Now remember, Kanye had a school going, and maybe still has it going. I don't know if it's still going, but so Kanye's been into this whole Genevan project himself.
Now, he's only been messing around with prototypes. But the size of that market is bigger than all the things he's ever done. Right? The potential size of that is basically Elon Musk-sized opportunity. And nobody's really competing. Because other people who want to build homes are just going to be home builders, and they'll build something boring that didn't move your soul. Yay, potentially, could bring what he's brought to other fields to the housing field and make you excited about it. And then suddenly, every community he builds or license, he makes $100 million. And 100 million here, 100 million there, it adds up over time. He could be the richest man in America in 20 years.
Again, this John Calvin, Michael Servetus, Kanye West. Kanye is in some ways working on parallel projects in different ways, and it's just all rather amazing.
He sticks to his principles.
Oh, he does.
Yeah, so he asks to see Calvin just before he's due to be burned. Calvin goes to see him. Calvin tries to persuade him to recant, which would, of course, have preserved him from death. Servetus refuses. As Servetus is being led to the place of execution, one of Calvin's closest friends and followers goes with him, again, trying to persuade him to recant. But, of course, Servetus doesn't, and so he is burned. And this, of course, is a terrible and enduring blow to Calvin's reputation. And so Servetus's friends, his fellow scholars, the ones we were talking about, they condemn him as a new pope, as a Herod, as a Pontius Pilate. And in 1554, which is the year after Servetus's death, a book appears which is called Concerning Heretics and Whether They're to Be Persecuted. And these are a collection of texts from the writings of the kind of reformers we've been talking about, the more scholarly Erastian reformers, in which they very explicitly oppose the death penalty for heretics. You know, they say full stop, this is not to be done, it's too papist. And the preface to this book is written by a particular friend of Servetus, a man called Sebastian Castellio, who is also a great opponent of Calvin. And at the core of his argument is one that will reverberate into the early modern period and into the Enlightenment. And he says that the reason that Protestants and indeed Christians should not persecute and execute heretics is that basically that is what happened to Christ. And this, of course, is an argument that Voltaire will pick up.
Right.
And it's an argument that free thinkers who are opposed to Christianity will pick up. They will say, you know, we're not against Christ, but we're against the framework of religion.
Yeah.
And you can see here
the career of Philip Pullman.
Well, you can see the way in which the Reformation is the womb both of the kind of the distinctive quality of religiosity which will mark American culture, but also that strain of free thinking, emphasis on tolerance, which is also bred of the Reformation.
Yeah,
that tension, that the ambivalences, the paradoxes, which will mark the history of modern Europe and modern America. That's why I think Calvin's Geneva is so fascinating, and why
I was about to say, yeah, it's a tension not just in the reaction to the execution of Michael Servetus, but it's also a tension that's implicit in the structure of Calvin's Geneva, isn't it? Order and liberty, as you said.
It is. And the influence of Calvin's Geneva on the Dutch Republic, on England, on Scotland, on the English colonies in America, it is impossible to emphasize how huge the influence is.
Right.
And that's why I mean this incident is absolutely fascinating, I think, for the light that it sheds on the way that our culture, manifests itself right at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And we're still going through it. We're still dealing with those issues, trying to figure out how to go forward. And so in that way, Kanye West, Ye, is right there in the line with the little cities he wants to build. City on a hill, comes right out of, the Mayflower community, deep in the American consciousness, freedom, order, liberty, religion, godly society. It's all right there. And so, it's easy just to sort of react at Kanye, but we're still continuing to try to work these things through. So I hope this was enlightening for you, and can't wait to see the comments on this one.